all over. So he tried this one, it had 2 glasses and knocked him sideways. And he was very, very sloshed, you know. He said, oi.
On the day Peter Sellers died in 1980, he was trying to change his will to cut his 4th wife out of it. He didn't make it in time. The paperwork was never finalized. So when the 54-year-old comic genius, the man who had been Inspector Clouseau, the man Stanley Kubrick called the greatest actor alive, suffered the heart attack that killed him, his entire fortune, around £4.5 million, went to the wife he had been trying to disinherit hours earlier. His 3 children got £800 each. That is how the life of one of the funniest men who ever lived actually ended. Not with laughter, with a will he couldn't finish, a family he had shattered, and 4 marriages that had each, in their own way, been a kind of disaster. Peter Sellers married 4 times. He proposed to his 2nd wife after knowing her for 10 days. He married his 3rd while still obsessed with someone else. He got engaged to Liza Minnelli 3 days after meeting her, while married to wife number 3, in what his friends thought was a nervous breakdown. And he treated at least 2 of these women with a cruelty so severe that biographers have described him, flatly, as a monster behind closed doors. The same man, the gentle, brilliant, chameleon comedian the whole world adored on screen, and the raging, paranoid, controlling husband almost none of them ever knew. He once said something that explains more than any biography could. He said, "There used to be a me, but I had it surgically removed." He meant it as a joke. It was the truest thing he ever said. Peter Sellers could become anyone on screen, precisely because there was almost no one underneath. He had no stable self to return to when the cameras stopped, and so he went home to his wives, as whoever the fear and rage of that particular night made him, and the women who loved him never knew which man was going to walk through the door. And all of it, every marriage, every rage, every woman he drove away, traces back to one person who was not any of his wives. His mother. She called him Peter, a name that was not originally his. It had belonged to his older brother, who was stillborn before Peter was born. From his first breath, Peter Sellers was living in a dead child's name, raised by a mother so possessive that she told his first wife, to her face, that the girl only wanted her son for his body. A mother he was so bound to that when she died, he did not stop speaking to her. He held seances. He believed she contacted him from beyond the grave. He took her advice on business decisions after she was in the ground. He spent his whole life looking for a woman who could love him the way his mother had, completely, suffocatingly, without limit. 4 women tried. None of them could survive it. This is the tragic story of Peter Sellers and his 4 wives, and the dead woman who ruined all 4 marriages without ever being in the room. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Peter Sellers was named after a dead boy. Before he was born, his parents had another son. That child was stillborn. His name was going to be Peter. And when a healthy son arrived on September 8, 1925, in Southsea, on the English coast, they christened him Richard Henry Sellers, and then, almost immediately, started calling him Peter anyway, after the brother who never drew a breath. Think about what that does to the foundation of a person. Before he had any personality of his own, before he could speak or walk or understand anything, Peter Sellers was already a replacement, a stand-in for someone who had died. He was living inside another child's name, carrying the weight of a grief that had happened before he existed, expected on some unspoken level to be the son who was lost. Biographers have pointed to this as the origin of the thing that defined his entire life, the sense that there was no solid, original Peter Sellers at all, only a series of impersonations, because from birth he had been impersonating a dead brother. His parents were music hall performers, part of the world of British variety theatre, the travelling shows of singers and comedians and novelty acts that crisscrossed England playing to working-class audiences. His father, Bill, was a musician and all-around entertainer, and by most accounts a passive, gentle, emotionally distant man who receded into the background of his own family. His mother was the force. Her name was Agnes, but everyone called her Peg, and Peg Sellers was one of the most consequential stage mothers in the history of British entertainment, which is saying something, because that is a crowded field. Peg was domineering, possessive, ferociously ambitious for her son, and utterly without boundaries where he was concerned. She put him on a stage as a baby. He made his so-called debut at 2 weeks old, when a family friend carried him out from backstage during a performance. By the time he was 5, he was performing in revues. She thrust him into show business before he could possibly have chosen it for himself, because in Peg's mind, there was no meaningful separation between herself and her son. What was good for her was good for him. What she wanted, he wanted. She did not experience him as a separate person with his own desires, and so he never fully learned to experience himself that way either. The bond between them was, in the careful language of his biographers, abnormally close, unhealthy. It had, in the phrase one writer used, a dark symbiosis to it. Peg was domineering, and Peter was cringing and shy, and the two of them were locked into each other in a way that left no room for anyone else, ever. She spoiled him completely. She smothered him with a love that was total and conditional at the same time, love that came with the absolute expectation that he would belong to her, and only her, forever, and she allowed his behavior to go entirely unchecked. Whatever he did, however he acted, Peg's response was that her Peter could do no wrong. He grew up with a mother who worshipped him and controlled him in equal measure, and who never once required him to consider the feelings or the needs of another human being, because in Peg's universe, there were no other human beings that mattered. At the same time, in one of the contradictions that ran all through his childhood, she would leave him. She and Bill were touring performers, and there were long stretches, weeks at a time, when they simply parked their only child with relatives and went off to work. So the boy got the worst possible combination, a mother who was suffocatingly present when she was there and completely gone when she wasn't. Total love and total abandonment, alternating, with no way to predict which was coming. That is the exact recipe for an adult who cannot trust love, who clings and rages and drives people away, who needs to possess the people he loves completely, because he learned as a child that love could vanish at any moment without warning. He was sent to a Catholic school in London, St. Aloysius, run by an order of religious brothers, which is notable mostly because Sellers was of part Jewish descent through his mother, and was almost certainly the only student of that background in the school. And even there, the thing that would make him famous was already visible. One biographer noted that Sellers learned his catechism not by understanding it, but by perfectly imitating the cadence and the pitch of the brothers reciting it. He did not absorb the meaning, he absorbed the performance. He could reproduce the exact sound of a person without any of the substance underneath, and he was doing it as a schoolboy. That was the gift and the wound, and they were the same thing. Peter Sellers could become anyone. He had an almost supernatural ability to disappear into another person, to take on their voice, their body, their entire being, so completely that he seemed to vanish and be replaced. Directors and fellow actors described it with a kind of awe that shaded into unease. He did not play characters, he became them, and then he could not always find his way back. Because the terrible secret underneath the genius was that there was no stable person for him to come back to. He had been a replacement from birth, controlled by his mother into having no independent self, and so the empty space where an identity should have been was the very thing that let him fill it, temporarily, with anyone at all. He said it himself, later, in the most famous thing he ever said off-screen. Asked about his own personality, he replied, "There used to be a me, but I had it surgically removed." People laughed. It was a good line. It was also a confession and a diagnosis, and possibly the single most honest sentence Peter Sellers ever spoke. There was no me. There was a mother's possession, a dead brother's name, and a bottomless need to be loved completely, wrapped around an emptiness that terrified him. He served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, entertaining the troops, honing the impressions. After the war, he clawed his way up through the vaudeville circuit and into radio, And by the late 1940s, he had found the vehicle that would make him famous, a surreal, anarchic BBC radio comedy called The Goon Show, which he created with a few like-minded friends, and which would go on to influence everything from Monty Python to the whole future of British comedy. He was becoming a star, and he was about to meet the first of the 4 women who would try, and fail, to love a man who had had himself surgically removed. Her name was Anne Howe. She was young, beautiful, and studying to be an actress, and she had no idea that the charming, brilliant, funny man courting her came with a mother who would tell her, to her face, that she only wanted him for his body. Anne Howe was studying acting at drama school when she met Peter Sellers, and she was very young and he was very persuasive. She was an Australian-born aspiring actress, training in London, when their paths crossed at the start of the 1950s. Sellers was a rising radio star, not yet a film actor, but already famous through The Goon Show and already possessed of the enormous, restless charm that he could turn on like a tap. He courted her intensely. He was funny, he was talented, he was going somewhere, and to a young woman at drama school he must have seemed like the most exciting man in London. They married in 1951. He was 25, she was younger still. And from the very beginning, there were 3 people in the marriage. Peg Sellers did not surrender her son to another woman. She had never surrendered him to anyone, and she was not going to start now. From the moment Anne appeared, Peg treated her as a rival, an intruder, a threat to the total possession of Peter that she regarded as her birthright. She disliked Anne openly. And in one of the details that tells you everything about the atmosphere this marriage was conducted in, Peg told her son, directly, that Anne only wanted him for his body. His own mother, warning him against his wife, poisoning the well before the marriage had a chance to breathe. Anne herself, years later, understood exactly what she had been up against. She described the dynamic between Peter and his mother as the thing that shaped every relationship he ever had with a woman. She saw it clearly. Her husband had been raised to expect a woman to mother him the way Peg had mothered him, completely, worshipfully, without limit or independence, and no actual wife could ever provide that, because no wife is a mother, and no healthy relationship works that way. Anne was being asked to fill a role that could not be filled, judged against a standard no living woman could meet, by a man who did not consciously understand that this was what he was doing. For a while, it worked well enough. Sellers's career exploded through the 1950s. He moved from radio into film, and his gift for transformation made him almost immediately one of the most interesting screen actors in Britain. He was extraordinary in The Lady Killers, alongside Alec Guinness. He won a British Academy Award for I'm All Right, Jack in 1959, playing a union shop steward so completely realized that audiences forgot they were watching the Goon Show comedian. He was becoming, by the end of the decade, an international name. He and Anne had 2 children. Michael was born in 1954, Sarah followed in 1957, and the arrival of those children exposed something in Peter Sellers that would define him as a father and, eventually, as a man. He could not tolerate sharing the love in a room. A child, by its nature, demands attention, care, primacy. Sellers, who had never stopped being a child himself in the deepest sense, experienced his own children partly as competitors for the love he needed to be entirely his. He loved them, in his way. He also raged at them, frightened them, and used them, and the using got worse, as his marriage to Anne began to fail. The failure had a specific trigger, and her name was Sophia Loren. In 1960, Sellers co-starred with Loren in a romantic comedy called The Millionairess. Loren was, at that moment, one of the most beautiful and desired women in the world, a genuine international sex symbol at the height of her fame. And Sellers, married with 2 young children, fell for her completely and publicly. This was not a discreet affair. This was a middle-aged comedian losing his head entirely, declaring his love for his glamorous co-star, by some accounts announcing his feelings for her in front of his own wife. He became convinced they were destined to be together. He proposed marriage to her. Sophia Loren turned him down. She was married to the producer Carlo Ponti, and had, by every indication, no romantic interest in Sellers whatsoever. Whatever chemistry existed on screen, and there was some, it existed on screen. Lauren was fond of him and found him funny and talented, and that was the extent of it. His obsession was entirely one-sided, a fantasy he had constructed and then mistaken for reality, which was a pattern that would repeat with devastating consequences later in his life. But the damage to his marriage was done regardless of whether Lauren returned his feelings. Peter Sellers had publicly fallen in love with another woman while married to Anne, and he had done it in a way that humiliated his wife and made the state of the marriage obvious to everyone. The fantasy of Sophia Loren had cracked open something that had been under pressure for years, and once it cracked, it could not be repaired. And it was in the wreckage of the collapsing marriage to Anne that Peter Sellers revealed the full extent of what he actually was behind the beloved public face. Because as the marriage died, he began doing things to his own children that were so disturbing that, decades later, they remain some of the most damning evidence of the man's cruelty. He started waking them up at night. He would come into the children's rooms in the dark, rouse them from sleep, and interrogate them. He wanted answers to questions no child should ever be asked, and he wanted them from children too young to defend themselves against the weight of it. He would ask his son whether he thought Peter should divorce their mother. He would demand that the children choose. And the questions got crueler and more direct as his own control slipped. What he was really asking, underneath all of it, was the only question that had ever mattered to him. The question his whole life had been organized around. Do you love me most? Do you love me completely? Am I the one you would choose above everyone? He was asking his own small children to be his mother. And they could not do it, because they were children, and they wanted their actual mother, and that answer was the one thing Peter Sellers could not bear to hear. The night Peter Sellers asked his children to choose between their parents, they gave him an honest answer, and he never forgave them for it. The scene has been documented by his son Michael, who lived it and later wrote about it, and it is one of the most revealing things in the entire record of Sellers's life. Around 1962, with the marriage to Anne in its final collapse, Sellers sat his two children down, Michael and Sarah, and asked them a question. Whom do you love more, your mother or me? Sarah, trying to be kind, trying to give the answer that would hurt no one, said that she loved them both equally. Michael told the truth. He said, I love my mum. And Peter Sellers, a grown man, a father, one of the most celebrated comedians in the world, looked at his own children and told them that he never wanted to see either of them again. Then he divorced their mother. Sit with the full horror of that, because it is the key to everything. A man asks two small children to rank their love for their parents, and when one of them honestly chooses his mother, the father responds by rejecting both children, permanently, in the same breath. That is not the behavior of an adult. That is the behavior of the child Peter Sellers had never stopped being, the little boy who needed to be loved most and completely, and could not survive being loved second. His own son had done the unforgivable thing, which was to love someone else more than Peter, and Peter's response was the response of a wounded 5-year-old with the power of a grown man. If you will not love me completely, you are dead to me. It is exactly what he would do, over and over, to every woman he married. The children just got the first, clearest version of it. The marriage to Anne ended in divorce in 1963, and the pattern of how Sellers treated the people closest to him was now fully visible, at least to the people close enough to see it. To the public, of course, none of this existed. To the public, Peter Sellers was the lovable genius, the man of 1,000 voices, and he was about to become far more famous than he had ever been. Because in 1963, the same window in which his first marriage was ending, Sellers made 2 films that would define his career and cement his immortality. The first was Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick's black comedy about nuclear apocalypse, in which Sellers played 3 completely different roles: an RAF officer, the American president, and the deranged ex-Nazi scientist of the title. Each one so distinct and so fully inhabited that audiences could scarcely believe they were watching the same actor. Kubrick, a famously demanding and unsentimental director, regarded Sellers as something close to a genius and gave him the freedom to improvise in a way Kubrick gave almost no one. The performance is still studied as one of the great feats of screen acting. The second was The Pink Panther, in which Sellers played a bumbling French police detective named Inspector Clouseau. Clouseau was a minor role in the original conception, but Sellers took the character and built him into something so gloriously, physically funny, that he stole the entire film and launched a franchise that would run for the rest of his life and beyond. Clouseau made Peter Sellers one of the biggest comedy stars in the world. The pratfalls, the mangled French accent, the absolute dignity of a man who is catastrophically incompetent and does not know it, all of it came out of the same bottomless capacity for transformation that had started with a schoolboy imitating the cadence of his catechism. So consider where Peter Sellers stood in 1963 and 1964. He was, by any professional measure, at the absolute summit. He had just given one of the greatest comic performances in the history of cinema in Dr. Strangelove, and created one of the most beloved comic characters of all time in Clouseau. He was internationally famous, wealthy, in demand, adored. And he was, privately, a man who had just told his own children he never wanted to see them again, whose first marriage had died in a haze of obsession over a woman who did not want him, who had no stable self and no capacity to be loved in any way that could satisfy him, and who was about to do the entire catastrophic thing all over again, faster and worse, with the next woman unlucky enough to attract his attention. Because that is the thing about the pattern, it did not slow down after Anne. It accelerated. Each marriage would be entered into more impulsively than the last, would reveal his cruelty faster than the last, and would collapse more spectacularly than the last. He had learned nothing from the wreckage of his first marriage, because the problem was not something a person could learn his way out of. The problem was structural. It was Peg. It was the dead brother's name. It was the surgically removed self. It was a man looking for a mother in every wife, and destroying each wife for failing to be one. He would meet the next one because he saw her photograph in a newspaper and decided, on the spot, that he was going to have her. He would propose to her within 10 days of their first meeting. He would nearly destroy her career out of pure jealousy, suffer a string of heart attacks that should have killed him, and turn the most glamorous marriage in 1960s show business into a private nightmare that ended with him calling her, in front of an entire film crew, a word too ugly to say here. Her name was Britt Eklund. She was 21 years old, and she had no idea what was about to walk into her life. Peter Sellers fell in love with Britt Eklund before he ever met her, which was itself a warning, if anyone had known to read it. He saw her photograph in a newspaper in early 1964. She was a 21-year-old Swedish actress and model, blonde and luminous, newly arrived in London and largely unknown outside Scandinavia. Sellers looked at the picture and decided, with the same instant total conviction he had once felt about Sophia Loren, that this was the woman he was going to marry. He had not spoken to her. He knew nothing about her. He had fallen in love with an image in a newspaper, which is to say, he had fallen in love with a fantasy he could project anything he wanted onto, and that is exactly the kind of love a man with no self falls into. He arranged to meet her. He pursued her with overwhelming intensity, the full force of his charm and his fame and his money aimed at a young woman a world away from home. And it worked, because it was designed to work, because Peter Sellers, when he wanted something, was one of the most persuasive men alive. They married on February 19th, 1964. They had known each other for roughly 10 days. 10 days. A man marrying a stranger, again, on the strength of a fantasy, again. And this time the fantasy curdled into something darker, almost immediately, because Britt Eklund was not a photograph. She was a real person, with her own career, her own ambitions, her own friends, her own inner life, and Peter Sellers could not tolerate any of it. What he wanted was total possession. What he had married was an independent young woman. The collision was instant and it was ugly. Almost as soon as they were married, Sellers's jealousy took over. He was consumed by suspicion that she was unfaithful, or would be, or wanted to be. There is no evidence she gave him any cause. The jealousy came entirely from inside him, from the same bottomless insecurity that had wrecked every relationship of his life. The certainty that love would be taken from him, that he would not be chosen, that he was not enough. And so he set about controlling her with a thoroughness that biographers have described, without hesitation, as abuse. He interrogated her about imagined infidelities. He exploded into rages. He belittled her, attacking her looks, her intelligence, her talent, the standard vocabulary of a man trying to destroy a woman's sense of her own worth so that she will be too diminished to leave. And he went after the thing that made her independent of him, which was her career. Britt Ekland was an actress. She had her own work, her own trajectory, her own reasons to exist in the world that had nothing to do with being Mrs. Peter Sellers. Sellers could not stand it. In one particularly telling episode, he manipulated her into taking time off from a film she was shooting and then simply would not let her go back. He kept her away from the set until her part was recast and filmed with another actress. He destroyed a piece of her career on purpose, to keep her home, to keep her his, to sever the thing that connected her to a life outside his control. It is one of the clearest illustrations imaginable of what he actually wanted from a wife, which was not a partner, but a possession. The rages frightened everyone around him, including his children from his first marriage, who witnessed his behavior toward Britt and saw the same Jekyll and Hyde monster their mother had seen, the charming public genius and the vicious private tyrant, occupying the same body, switching without warning. And the marriage played out against a backdrop of Sellers's own body beginning to fail him. Shortly after marrying Britt, in 1964, Sellers suffered a series of heart attacks, a cascade of them over a matter of days, that very nearly killed him. At one point, his heart stopped entirely, and he was, briefly, clinically dead before being revived. He was not yet 40. The heart disease that would eventually kill him had announced itself early and violently, and it added a layer of fear and physical fragility to a man already ruled by fear. He became, if anything, more difficult, more volatile, more impossible to live with, as his own mortality pressed in on him. They had a daughter, Victoria, born in 1965. A child, again, entering a household ruled by a father who could not share love and could not be soothed. And the marriage, which had been in trouble from nearly the first week, ground its way toward an ending that matched the ugliness of everything that had come before it. There is a moment that captures the whole marriage in a single image. The day before Sellers was to be honoured at Buckingham Palace, appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, one of the highest honours the country could give him, he and Britt had a fight, and she scratched his face. He had to cover the marks with makeup to go and receive his honour from the establishment that adored him, the beloved national treasure, arriving to be knighted in all but name, with a wife's scratches hidden under grease paint. And there was the moment on a later film set, when the two of them were working together, and Sellers, no longer bothering to hide what he had become, turned to the director, Robert Parrish, and said of his own wife, "I'm not coming back after lunch if that bitch is on the set." That was what the fairy tale marriage of the glamorous Swedish starlet and the beloved comic genius had become. A man refusing to work in the same room as the wife he had married after 10 days, referring to her by an obscenity in front of the crew. Britt Ekland filed for divorce. It was granted in 1968. She was still in her mid-20s. She had married a fantasy and been trapped inside a nightmare, and she got out younger than most people get married at all. Peter Sellers was now twice divorced, twice a father to children he alternately smothered and rejected, and completely incapable of understanding that the problem was him. He genuinely believed, each time, that he had simply not yet found the right woman, that the next one would be the one who loved him the way he needed to be loved, that the fantasy was real, and only the specific women kept failing it. He was about to marry again, and this time the marriage would barely register before he did something so strange, so publicly unhinged, that the people who loved him began to fear he was losing his mind entirely. He was going to get engaged to Liza Minnelli 3 days after meeting her, while still married to his third wife. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The third marriage barely gets remembered, and that is partly the point of it. In 1970, 2 years after Britt Eklund divorced him, Peter Sellers married Miranda Quarry. She was a British socialite and fashion model, the stepdaughter of a lord, part of the fashionable Mayfair set of swinging London. She was 23 years old. Sellers was 45, more than 2 decades older. They had met through the London social scene. She worked at a fashionable boutique that he frequented, having his clothes made there for his roles and his public appearances. Miranda was aristocratic, poised, and connected to a world of English privilege that Sellers, the music hall performer's son with the part Jewish mother, had spent his life on the edges of. Marrying her was, among other things, a form of social arrival. There is a famous photograph from the wedding in which Sellers has his dogs standing as bridesmaids, dressed for the occasion, which tells you something about the tone of the whole thing. It was stylish, it was a little absurd, and it was not, at any point, a stable foundation for a marriage. Because Peter Sellers, married to his third wife, was not actually present in the marriage at all. He was, as he had been his entire life, looking past whoever he had for whoever he might obsess over next. And in 1973, still married to Miranda, he found her. He went to see Liza Minnelli perform. Minnelli was, at that moment, one of the biggest stars in the world. She had just won the Academy Award for Cabaret. She was the daughter of Judy Garland and Vincente Minnelli, entertainment royalty, a genuine phenomenon at the peak of her fame. Sellers saw her perform live, and the old machinery kicked in exactly as it had with Sophia Loren and with Britt Eklund's photograph. He fell, instantly and totally, into an obsession he mistook for love. 3 days later, they announced they were getting engaged. 3 days. And it gets stranger, because the engagement was impossible on both ends. Sellers was still married to Miranda Quarry, and Liza Minnelli was, at that time, engaged to Desi Arnaz Jr., the son of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. So the announcement was of an engagement between 2 people, one of whom was married to someone else, and the other of whom was engaged to someone else, arrived at 72 hours after they met. It lasted about a month before it collapsed. And this time, the people around Peter Sellers did not see a man in love. They saw a man coming apart. His friends became genuinely concerned that he was having a nervous breakdown. The impulsiveness, the total disconnection from reality, the speed with which he had blown up his own life and Minnelli's over a fantasy, the sheer public strangeness of it, alarmed the people who knew him. One description of Sellers from this period has stuck to him ever since: a deeply troubled man, distrustful, self-absorbed, ultimately self-destructive, the complete contradiction. A man who could be anyone on screen, and was no one off it, spinning without an anchor, chasing love he could never catch, because he had no self to receive it with. The Minnelli engagement was the moment the private disorder became publicly visible even to strangers. For years, the cruelty and the chaos had been things that happened behind closed doors, witnessed by wives and children and crew members. Now, Peter Sellers was announcing engagements to Oscar-winning superstars 3 days after meeting them while married to someone else, and the world could see, if it chose to look, that something was badly wrong with the beloved comedian. The marriage to Miranda Quarry did not survive the surrounding chaos, though in truth, it had never really been a marriage in any deep sense. They divorced in 1974. Miranda, to her credit and somewhat unusually among Sellers's wives, remained on friendly terms with him until his death, which suggests that their union may have been the least destructive of the 4, precisely because it had never involved the intensity that Sellers reserved for the women he genuinely obsessed over. She had married a fantasy of aristocratic stability. He had married a fantasy of social arrival, and when both fantasies faded, they were able to part without the violence that had marked his other endings. She went on to marry twice more, eventually becoming a countess, and lived until 2020. By the mid-1970s, Peter Sellers was a wreck in almost every dimension, except, intermittently, the professional one. His heart was failing, he had a pacemaker fitted, and lived under the constant shadow of the heart disease that had nearly killed him a decade earlier. His mental state was fragile and getting worse. His career had gone through a serious slump, a run of flops that had left him, for a time, close to broke, before the Pink Panther series revived him commercially in the mid-1970s, with a string of Clouseau sequels that made enormous money and that Sellers, by then, largely hated making. And through all of it, there was still Peg. His mother had died in 1967, in the middle of his marriage to Britt. But death had not ended the relationship. Sellers, who believed deeply in the supernatural, and had for years, did not accept that his mother was gone. He held seances to contact her. He consulted mediums. He believed, sincerely, that Peg spoke to him from beyond the grave, that she guided him, that she continued to advise him on his decisions, including business decisions, from the other side. The woman who had possessed him in life went on possessing him in death, and Peter Sellers went on being unable to fully love any living woman because the one who owned him was no longer even alive to compete with. He was fragile, failing, twice more divorced, chasing ghosts and fantasies, his heart quite literally breaking down in his chest. And then, in 1977, at a party, he met a 22-year-old actress named Lynn Frederick. She would be his last wife. She would be with him when he died. And in the end, she would inherit everything he had, because the one thing Peter Sellers could not do, even on the final day of his life, was finish what he started. Lynn Frederick was 22 years old when Peter Sellers decided she would be his fourth wife, and by now the speed of it should surprise no one. She was a British actress, young and strikingly beautiful, known for a delicate, fairy tale princess quality that the press liked to write about. She had appeared in films and in a television adaptation of The Wives of Henry VI, which is its own small piece of dark irony, given that she was about to become the last in a line of 4 wives herself. Sellers met her at a party in 1977. He was 51. He proposed, by most accounts, the second time they met. 51 years old, 3 failed marriages behind him, a failing heart, a documented history of driving women away with jealousy and rage. And Peter Sellers looked at a 22-year-old and did the exact same thing he had done at every stage of his life. Fell instantly, decided immediately, proposed almost at once. He had learned nothing because there was nothing to learn. The engine that drove him was the same at 51 as it had been at 39 and 25. Find a woman, project the fantasy of total love onto her, marry her fast before reality can intrude, and then begin the slow, grinding destruction when she turns out to be a person instead of a mother. They married on February 18, 1977. By this point, Sellers was a genuinely sick man. The heart disease that had first struck in 1964 had never left him. He had a pacemaker. He had survived multiple heart attacks. His doctors had told him plainly that his heart was in serious condition and that he needed to be careful, needed possibly to have surgery, needed to reduce the strain on a body that had been failing for well over a decade. He was, in the last years of the 1970s, living on borrowed time and knew it. The marriage to Lynn was, like the others, turbulent. The same patterns reasserted themselves: the jealousy, the volatility, the impossible demands, the inability to be satisfied by any real relationship with any real woman. But there was less time now for the full catastrophic arc to play out, because Peter Sellers was running out of time altogether. He made one last great creative effort. In 1979, he starred in Being There, a quiet, strange, brilliant film in which he played Chance, a simple-minded gardener who is mistaken for a wise man by everyone around him. It was, many critics felt, the finest and most controlled performance of his career, and it earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. There is something almost unbearably poignant about it. At the very end of his life, Peter Sellers gave his greatest performance, playing a man who is a blank, an empty vessel onto whom everyone projects whatever they need to see. A man with no self, mistaken for a genius. He had spent his whole life saying, "There used to be a me, but I had it surgically removed." And here, at the end, he played the surgical absence itself and made it beautiful. But the marriage was falling apart underneath the triumph, the way the marriages always did. And this time, Sellers's response was not just rage, it was money. In the final period of his life, Peter Sellers decided he wanted Lynn Frederick out of his will. The reasons were the tangled reasons of a dying, disordered man in a deteriorating marriage. Resentment, suspicion, the sense of grievance he carried toward every wife eventually, the desire to punish. Whatever the exact motives, the decision was real. He wanted to change his will so that his considerable fortune, around £4.5 million, would not go to his fourth wife. And here, the whole tragic shape of Peter Sellers's life narrows to a single point, a single unfinished action. He did not do it in time. The change to the will was never completed. The paperwork was never finalized. Peter Sellers, the man who could never finish a marriage well, who could never resolve anything, who left every relationship in wreckage, could not even complete the final act of severance he had decided on. The intention was there. The execution never came. On July 22, 1980, in London, where he had come to work on yet another Pink Panther screenplay, the film role he had grown to hate but could not escape because it paid, Peter Sellers suffered a massive heart attack in his suite at the Dorchester Hotel. He was rushed to a hospital. He never regained consciousness. A team of 10 specialists worked on him and could do nothing. His heart, in the words of the hospital spokesman, simply faded away. He died on July 24, 1980. He was 54 years old. At his bedside were his fourth wife, Lynn Frederick, and, in a detail that says something about the strange loyalties of the people he had hurt, his second wife, Britt, and their daughter Victoria, then 15. The women he had tormented came to watch him die. And because he had never finished changing the will, because the man who could complete nothing had left even his final act of spite incomplete, Lynn Frederick inherited almost his entire fortune. Around £4.5 million, worth many times that in today's money, went to the wife he had been trying, in his last weeks, to cut out. His 3 children, Michael and Sarah from his first marriage, Victoria from his second, the children he had woken in the night and interrogated and rejected and alternately smothered and abandoned across his whole disordered life, received £800 each. £800 from a fortune of £4.5 million. That was Peter Sellers's final message to his children, delivered from beyond the grave through the cold mechanism of a will, and it was consistent with everything that had come before. He had told his son, at 10 years old, that he never wanted to see him again for the crime of loving his mother. Now, in death, he made the rejection permanent and financial. The children got almost nothing. Friends of Sellers, appalled, appealed to Lynn Frederick to share the estate with the disinherited children, to do the decent thing, to correct what was so obviously a cruelty, compounded by an accident of timing. She refused. She kept it all. And that decision would set in motion the strange, sad final chapter of the story of Peter Sellers and his 4 wives, the chapter that played out after he was already in the ground. The money did not save Lynn Frederick. If anything, it destroyed her. She had inherited a fortune of around £4.5 million, along with the properties, including a Swiss chalet in Gestard. She was 25 years old, and instead of freedom, what she got was one of the most vicious public backlashes in British celebrity history. The press decided she was a gold digger, a young woman who had married a dying, wealthy, much older star, been married to him for barely 3 years, and walked away with everything, while his children got £800 each. The story wrote itself, and the public ate it up, and Lynn Frederick became, almost overnight, one of the most reviled women in Britain. Her career did not survive it. She had been a working actress with real credits and a Best Newcomer award to her name. But after the will scandal, she was effectively blacklisted. Hollywood would not touch her. The offers dried up. The reputation she had built was buried under the single fact that she was the woman who had taken Peter Sellers's money from his children. Whether that was fair almost did not matter. Perception was the reality, and the perception destroyed her. She married again quickly, to the television broadcaster David Frost, in January of 1981, barely 6 months after Sellers died. That marriage lasted 17 months. She married a third time, to a Californian heart surgeon, and had her only child, a daughter, before that marriage also collapsed in 1991. And then Lynn Frederick came apart. She had, by the accounts of the people who saw her, become obsessed with Peter Sellers's memory. She kept a shrine to him. She could not let go of the man who had married her, tormented her, tried to disinherit her, failed and died. After her third divorce, her health deteriorated badly. She drank heavily. She suffered from severe depression. Victoria Sellers, Peter's daughter with Britt Eklund, visited her about 3 weeks before the end and found her in a devastating state, sitting in her kitchen barely able to move, drinking vodka straight from a jug, a woman in total collapse. On April 27, 1994, Lynn Frederick was found dead in her West Los Angeles home. She was 39 years old. The autopsy could not determine a definitive cause. There was no evidence of foul play. Some suspected suicide. The coroner would not confirm it. What is beyond dispute is that a young woman who had inherited millions died alone, ravaged by alcohol and depression, at 39, having never escaped the shadow of the man whose fortune she had won. The money was a curse. It had bought her nothing but ruin. The other wives fared better, mostly by getting far enough away. Britt Eklund survived Peter Sellers and built a full life after him. She had a famous relationship with the musician Rod Stewart, played a Bond girl in The Man with the Golden Gun, married again, and became, in the fullness of time, a survivor rather than a victim, one of the few people who could speak about Sellers with the clear eyes of someone who had gotten out young and lived a whole other life on the far side of him. She is still alive. Anne Howe, the first wife, the one who had understood earliest and most clearly what Sellers's mother had done to him, lived quietly out of the spotlight, having raised the 2 children Sellers had rejected. Miranda Quarry, the third wife, the aristocrat, went on to marry twice more, became a countess, and remained on good terms with Sellers until his death. She lived until 2020. But the cruelest echo, the one that closes the whole story with an almost unbearable symmetry, came through the children. Michael Sellers, the son, the boy who at 10 years old had told his father the truth, that he loved his mum, and been told in return that his father never wanted to see him again. The boy who had grown up rejected, disinherited, given £800 from a fortune of millions. Michael spent much of his adult life trying to make sense of his father, writing books about him, unable, in the words of those close to him, ever to get over how things had been left between them. His father's rejection, one relative said, ate him up. It played on him his entire life. Michael Sellers died of a heart attack, the same way his father died. He had inherited Peter's heart trouble along with everything else Peter had given him, which was to say, along with almost nothing and a lifetime of wounds. He died on July 24, 2006. Peter Sellers had died on July 24, 1980. Michael died on the exact 26th anniversary of his father's death, to the day. The son who had spent his whole life unable to escape his father did not escape him, even in the manner and the timing of his dying. He followed him out of the world through the same failing heart, on the same date, a quarter-century later, as if the connection Peter had poisoned in life could not be severed even by death. Look at the whole shape of it. A boy named after his own stillborn brother, raised by a mother who possessed him so completely that he never developed a self of his own, who told his first wife that the girl only wanted him for his body, who went on speaking to him from beyond the grave, through seances after she died. A man who became the greatest character actor of his generation, precisely because there was no character underneath, no stable person to interrupt the transformations, only an emptiness that could be filled with anyone. A man who spent his entire life looking for a woman who could love him the way his mother had, totally and suffocatingly and without limit, and who married 4 of them looking for it, and destroyed each one for the crime of being a real person instead of the fantasy he needed. He proposed to a woman he had seen in a newspaper. He got engaged 3 days after meeting Liza Minnelli, while married to someone else. He told his own children he never wanted to see them again. He tried, on the last day of his life, to cut his wife out of his will, and could not even finish that. He said there used to be a me, but I had it surgically removed. The world laughed, but 4 wives and 3 children lived inside the empty space where that self should have been, and not one of them ever found a person in there to love them back. Peter Sellers made the whole world laugh. He could not make a single person in his own house happy, because the little boy his mother had made could never believe, for even one moment, that he was loved enough, and a man who cannot believe he is loved will keep testing it, and testing it, and testing it, until everyone who ever loved him is gone. That was the tragedy behind the funniest man of his age. Not the 4 marriages, the reason there had to be 4, and the dead woman, buried since 1967, who was in every one of them, in the room, at the wedding, in the rage, in the séance, whispering to her son that no living woman would ever love him the way she did. She was right. That was the tragedy. She made sure of it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.